welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really compelling and pretty complex subject, Stockholm Syndrome.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
We've got an interdisciplinary look at this, and we're going, way beyond the usual story of that 1973 bank robbery in Stockholm.
Right.
Our goal here is really to understand the underlying mechanisms, like why a victim might start to identify with their abuser.
Exactly. And maybe to start, let's just get clear on what we mean by Stockholm Syndrome.
Good idea.
At its core, it's basically a situation where a victim develops positive feelings towards their captor or abuser.
Okay.
Now, the really important thing to understand right from the beginning is that this isn't like a rational choice they're making. It's often an unconscious psychological response.
Yeah.
It happens in incredibly threatening situations. Really, it's a survival strategy.
The survival strategy.
Okay.
And, while most people immediately think of that Stockholm bank robbery, and yeah, that's where the name comes from, our review points out something interesting. These kinds of attachments, in hostage situations,
Yes.
they've actually been seen much earlier.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we're talking about instances even during World War I and World War II.
Yeah.
So this isn't some, new or totally isolated thing.
Precisely. And that's key. To really understand the depth of this, we need to examine it from, well, multiple perspectives.
Right, not just one angle.
Exactly. This isn't just about individual psychology. Our sources really push us to consider the social dynamics, the political implications, and even how gender plays a role.
Gender too, interesting.
Yeah. We'll be exploring some really fascinating ideas, actually, from Viktor Frankl's work on, finding meaning in suffering.
Logotherapy.
That's it, logotherapy. And also the push and pull of the drama triangle, those classic roles of victim, persecutor, and rescuer.
Okay.
We'll also look at potential connections to the rise of authoritarianism globally, the influence of traditional gender roles, and even the dynamics of something called hypergamy.
Hypergamy. Okay, we'll get to that. It sounds like a much broader landscape than you might initially think.
It really is.
Okay, so let's jump into that first idea then, logotherapy and the search for meaning. Viktor Frankl's big idea was that our primary drive as humans is to find meaning, especially when things get really, really tough.
Right.
So how does that relate to someone developing Stockholm Syndrome?
Well, what's particularly insightful here is how individuals facing extreme duress, extreme threat, will often try to find some kind of shared understanding or maybe just a way to communicate without constant conflict with their captors.
Okay, like finding common ground.
Exactly. And while this might look like positive feelings on the surface, it's fundamentally about coping with a terrifying reality. The victim is, as our source puts it, seeking an existential anchor.
An existential anchor.
Yeah, to navigate the situation with the least amount of sort of psychological damage. Think of it as trying desperately to find a tiny patch of common ground in this whole landscape of threat.
Wow. So even when feeling completely powerless, people will instinctively try to find some purpose, something to keep them going.
Yes.
And in a really strange twist, the very person who is the source of all the danger the perpetrator can paradoxically become, like a source of hope for survival.
Yeah.
A weird way to reconstruct some meaning.
Exactly that. And the review really highlights that this isn't some conscious calculation. It's not like they're sitting there thinking it through.
Right, it's deeper than that.
Much deeper. It's
Yeah.
more about the victim subconsciously trying to anticipate the perpetrator's actions, trying to find some pattern in their behavior, really, just to increase their own chances of survival.
That makes sense.
So seeking the perpetrator's approval or maybe their empathy, these become ways to make an unbearable situation just slightly more tolerable. Logotherapy suggests that within this dynamic, the victim is searching for what they perceive as a vital value in their current circumstances. And that kind of paradoxically can strengthen their emotional connection to the abuser.
Strengthen it. Wow.
It's as if the mind just grabs onto any available lifeline in a truly desperate situation.
It's almost like the subconscious is just saying, okay, this is my reality now. How do I survive this?
Pretty much.
And finding some kind of connection, even if it's with the person causing the harm, becomes this really distorted way to try and ensure survival.
Yeah.
So viewed through that lens, through logotherapy, Stockholm Syndrome really underscores this incredible, almost unbelievable human capacity to seek and build meaning, even in the absolute direst of circumstances.
That's a crucial point. It really does highlight the strength of the human will to survive, doesn't it? And to find meaning, even when you're stripped of almost everything else.
Definitely. Okay, let's pivot now and talk about the drama triangle: victim, persecutor, rescuer. This sounds like a model that could really shed some light on the dynamics we see in Stockholm Syndrome.
Oh, it absolutely does. This model helps us analyze the roles people tend to take on in conflict situations and dependency cycles.
Right.
So, in the context of Stockholm Syndrome, the person held hostage or abused, they obviously start out genuinely in the victim role. That's undeniable.
Of course.
However, as the syndrome develops, while it might superficially look a bit like a kind of near consent,
Yeah.
it's absolutely vital to remember, and our review emphasizes this, that it stems from trauma. It's trauma-based.
Got it. Not consent. And the persecutor, or the perpetrator, they're the one in control, using manipulation, threats.
Right.
But the review mentions something really key here. They might also show occasional kindness or protection.
Right.
That must create a massive amount of confusion for the victim.
Oh, absolutely huge confusion. And what's particularly interesting is that very contradiction.
Yeah.
The perpetrator inflicts harm, but then offers these moments of respite, maybe a small act of consideration, a bit of food, whatever. This creates significant emotional confusion for the victim, blurring the lines between danger and this really distorted sense of safety. And desperate for any sign of security, the victim will often magnify these tiny acts of kindness, which can, in turn, start to cultivate positive feelings towards the very person who is abusing them. It's a really powerful psychological distortion.
Wow. And the rescuer role. Okay, that's where things can get a bit complicated, right? 'Cause
Right.
it sounds positive, but the review suggests it can actually sometimes reinforce the dependency.
Precisely. That's a really sharp point. While the rescuer's intentions are often good, an overly forceful intervention can sometimes inadvertently prevent the victim from recognizing their own coping mechanisms or maybe taking agency in their situation. And interestingly, the perpetrator themselves can sometimes step into that rescuer role, offering protection or help, which just further muddies the waters for the victim.
The perpetrator as rescuers.
Tricky.
Very tricky. And even external rescuers, like, say, law enforcement or support networks, they might unintentionally strengthen the victim-persecutor bond by disrupting the victim's already fragile way of just navigating the situation. So a victim who's developed this twisted sense of safety with their abuser might actually see an external rescuer as another threat, like another persecutor.
It can happen, yeah, because it disrupts their established, albeit incredibly unhealthy, way of coping.
Okay. And this whole interplay of roles, it really underscores the power imbalances right at the heart of Stockholm Syndrome.
Absolutely.
It's not just about the victim's feelings. It's about this toxic cycle of control and dependence. The review even points out that the victim's compliance can be seen as a defense mechanism against all this emotional and cognitive chaos.
Right, a way to manage the unmanageable.
And when the perpetrator also acts as a rescuer, the victim might subconsciously kind of validate their control.
Exactly. And the review brings up a particularly insightful point here. The victim may identify with the perpetrator as a way to feel closer to power.
Closer to power.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In a situation where they are utterly powerless, aligning themselves psychologically with the one who holds all the power can feel like a way to regain some tiny sense of control or safety. It's a fascinating, if pretty unsettling, psychological maneuver.
That is really insightful. Okay, let's consider, well, a potentially more challenging application of these ideas now. The rise of authoritarian powers. Can we actually see parallels with Stockholm Syndrome on a societal level?
This is a really important and maybe uncomfortable connection to explore. Our review definitely highlights the increasing trend of authoritarianism globally.
We see that.
Yeah, where democratic norms are weakening, rights are being restricted, often, under the guise of security or national unity.
Right, the justification.
Exactly. What's particularly thought-provoking is whether the positive sentiments, the support that can develop towards these authoritarian leaders, might bear some resemblance to a kind of societal Stockholm Syndrome.
So an entire population identifying with, maybe even supporting, a regime that's actively suppressing their freedoms. How does that kind of mass identification even take hold?
Well, authoritarian powers frequently employ crisis management and the deliberate cultivation of fear to establish this dynamic.
Okay, fear and crisis.
Yeah. By presenting society with a perceived significant threat, could be external enemies, economic instability, internal unrest, you name it. They can then position the strong leader as the indispensable savior figure.
The only one who can fix it.
Right. In this context, the leader can embody both the persecutor, especially towards any form of opposition, and the rescuer by promising safety and stability. And as fear becomes the dominant emotion within society, that rescuer role becomes far more readily accepted by the masses.
It's almost like the leader lights the fire and then rushes in with the water bucket, presenting themselves as the hero.
That's a good analogy. And within that atmosphere of intense psychological pressure, coupled with these promises of protection, people might indeed develop a kind of attachment to the leader.
Even if it seems totally contradictory, given the oppressive nature of the regime.
Precisely. The leader becomes both the source of the threat and the provider of security, which leads to a paradoxical but often very powerful form of consent. And think about how the manipulation of media, the suppression of dissenting voices, and the constant construction of narratives around enemies, both internal and external, can create this state of sustained stress and anxiety.
Yeah, constant pressure.
Under that kind of persistent pressure, rational dissent can start to erode, and identification with the leader can actually strengthen. It's kind of akin to a widespread feeling of helplessness, coupled with the perception of the leader as being strong and capable of rescuing us.
So these narratives of threat and security become the emotional bridges, the pathways, connecting society to the authoritarian leader.
Exactly.
And even when faced with obviously oppressive policies, people might internalize and actually justify the leader's actions. It's that unsettling idea of simultaneously experiencing oppression and feeling gratitude towards the oppressor.
It is unsettling. The review notes how these regimes concentrate power, weaken the rule of law, curtail freedoms, all contributing to a climate of social fear that then binds people to the savior leader.
And the lack of transparency, which is common in such regimes, only intensifies that insecurity, right? Making the promise of security even more appealing.
Absolutely. And charismatic leaders, they can cultivate the sort of father figure image, becoming both a figure of authority to be feared and, at the same time, a source of reassurance.
Oh.
As checks and balances on power weaken, dissenting voices get marginalized, pushed aside, further nudging society towards that central authority, a dynamic that strongly echoes Stockholm Syndrome.
So this identification with a strong leader helps explain why loyalty persists even when basic freedoms are just gone.
It can, yes. Social fear, whether it's fueled by external threats, economic instability, concerns about internal order, becomes a crucial tool for the continuation of authoritarian rule.
Fear keeps them in power.
Fear drives people to seek a savior, often the very leader perpetuating the oppressive system. And restrictive policies might get accepted as the lesser evil in the face of perceived greater dangers.
It's a chilling thought that identifying with an authoritarian power can become a way for people to create a perceived safe space, much like that psychological bonding between a hostage and their captor.
It is chilling. And with the control of media and the constant barrage of propaganda, it can almost become a form of compulsory acceptance. Obedience isn't just preferred, it's driven by necessity and a deep-seated desire to be on the same side as the ruler.
So the masses might even suppress their own rational objections, thinking, well, things could be much worse under someone else.
That's often the rationalization, yeah. The leader, simultaneously feared and seen as a savior, becomes this kind of safe harbor, discouraging questioning and fostering what the review calls a culture of obedience.
A culture of obedience. Wow. So the fundamental search for security under these regimes can indeed lead to emotional consent and unwavering loyalty, really mirroring those victim-perpetrator dynamics we talked about earlier.
And it's frequently cloaked in these appeals to lofty ideals like national unity, allowing the leader to be perceived as a savior rather than a persecutor. They garner gratitude by presenting themselves as the only viable solution to these often manufactured threats.
It's a deeply emotional attachment.
Very much so, like a victim interpreting minimal protection as an act of profound kindness. And then you get the development of leader cults, where the leader's personality becomes almost sacred, and any criticism is framed as betrayal.
So identifying with the leader becomes a way to safeguard your own identity within that system.
Exactly. And that widespread voluntary silence, that pragmatic compromising with authority just to avoid negative repercussions, it really echoes the behavior of a hostage trying to please their captor to survive.
That's a powerful and, frankly, deeply unsettling parallel. Okay, let's now turn our attention to another critical lens: gender roles and how they might intersect with Stockholm Syndrome, particularly within the context of violence against women.
Right. Gender roles, those societal norms, the codes that dictate how men and women are expected to behave, often play a significant role in rationalizing oppression, particularly in instances of violence against women.
Okay.
Our review highlights how ingrained sexist ideologies can actually foster an emotional attachment of victims to their abusers. It's quite disturbing.
So these deeply embedded societal expectations for men and women, they can create a power dynamic that makes it easier for this kind of syndrome to actually develop.
Absolutely. Patriarchal structures, with their historical roots in male dominance and the restriction of women's autonomy, can create an environment where women are less likely to report abuse or seek help.
Makes sense?
Cultural beliefs that might portray women as essentially male property or as inherently in need of protection can normalize violence in certain social contexts. It's awful, but it happens.
And the repeated reinforcement of these traditional roles can lead to women internalizing them, accepting abuse as just an unfortunate but maybe inevitable part of their lives.
Sadly, yes. And when you factor in emotional or economic dependence, it creates a situation where cooperating with an abusive partner might feel like the only viable path to survival or at least stability.
Yeah.
The review specifically mentions these patterns of the strong authoritarian man and the obedient dependent woman, significantly increasing the risk of a victim identifying with their perpetrator.
And tragically, violence against women is such a widespread global issue, deeply intertwined with these gender inequalities, potentially fostering these very victim-perpetrator bonds we're talking about.
Exactly. And the cycle of violence itself, that classic pattern, the buildup of tension, the act of violence followed by the honeymoon phase with apologies and promises, that can be incredibly manipulative.
Right, the honeymoon phase.
Victims might misinterpret that temporary improvement, that brief period of remorse or kindness, as a genuine positive bond with their abuser. It gives them false hope.
And the concept of learned helplessness you mentioned earlier.
Also crucial here, that feeling of losing faith in ever being able to escape their circumstances. It can lead women to see emotional attachment to the abuser as the safer, maybe the more realistic option.
And then you add those external pressures like economic dependency, limiting their actual choices, or the social stigma around divorce, or even just disclosing abuse.
Right. That can make women stay closer to the perpetrator, even defend the relationship, almost like displaying, as the review puts it, unconditional support for the abuser.
And the constant fear of the perpetrator can trigger those primal survival strategies, like compliance. It's just a devastating dilemma, being the target of violence while simultaneously feeling emotionally attached, maybe even dependent on the person inflicting it.
It's incredibly difficult. And as a psychological defense mechanism, victims might start glorifying limited kindness. They focus on and exaggerate those rare positive interactions with the abuser.
Magnifying the good bits.
Exactly. And when societal stereotypes portray women as inherently weak and needing protection, it's a really perverse irony that abusive men can sometimes be internalized as those protectors.
Oh, that's, yeah.
And this acceptance, tragically, reduces the likelihood of them seeking help. Ultimately, gender roles that limit women's rights and freedom significantly increase their vulnerability to this kind of emotional bonding with abusers.
So those societal expectations for women to be compliant and for men to be strong can push women into a passive role.
Yes, and that intermittent protective behavior from the abuser can further obscure the victim's own utter powerlessness in the situation.
And the social judgments against leaving an abusive relationship, that sense of shame, that feeling of it being wrong or sinful in some communities.
That can lead victims to internalize the problem, right? To see bonding more closely with the abuser as the only way forward, the only solution.
That internalized guilt, that it's somehow my fault mentality, can lead women to excuse the perpetrator's behavior, really solidifying that Stockholm Syndrome dynamic.
Exactly. So these deeply ingrained patriarchal norms don't just sort of facilitate the violence, they actively cultivate an environment where these emotional bonds with abusers can take root,
leading to a distorted perception of reality, where violence might even be rationalized as love or just a temporary lapse.
It's a deeply entrenched and incredibly damaging cycle.
Definitely. Now, the review also touches on something called hypergamy, the tendency often for women to choose a spouse of higher social or economic status, and how that might connect with Stockholm Syndrome. It adds another really fascinating layer.
Yeah, hypergamy. While it's not inherently abusive in itself, it can introduce significant power imbalances into relationships, particularly when it intersects with those existing gender roles we just discussed. Historically, it often served strategic purposes, like forging alliances between families or consolidating wealth. In contemporary society, it often manifests as women seeking partners with higher income, career status, or social standing, often with the understandable aim of achieving greater financial security.
So marriage can become not just about love and affection, but also about social and economic advancement.
It can be, yes.
And while there's nothing inherently wrong with seeking security, how does that power asymmetry potentially contribute to abuse and this Stockholm dynamic?
Well, the review points out that while hypergamous relationships can offer benefits, maybe better social connections, opportunities that significant difference in status can create a real power imbalance.
Right.
It potentially weakens the lower status partner's ability to make independent decisions, and in situations where abuse then occurs, this pre-existing imbalance can unfortunately contribute to identification with and a sense of loyalty towards the higher status partner, even in the face of mistreatment.
It's almost like an unspoken agreement, maybe, like the review suggests. The partner with higher status controls more resources, and the partner with lower status might unconsciously trade some personal autonomy for that.
That can be the underlying dynamic, yeah. And if abuse enters this equation, it can unfortunately create fertile ground for those Stockholm-like bonds to develop. The review also mentions how those pervasive Prince Charming narratives in media can normalize these expectations and maybe make it easier to overlook oppressive behaviors.
Ah, the fairy tale effect.
Kind of.
Oh.
And feelings of simple gratitude towards a partner perceived as having higher status can establish an inherently unequal dynamic from the start.
Okay.
And when abuse occurs within this context, it significantly increases the likelihood of a Stockholm Syndrome-like attachment forming. Women might remain in these relationships for the perceived security offered by a stronger partner, even if they're being abused, fearing the loss of status and all the associated advantages.
That thought process of, well, my partner allows me to live in better circumstances, can lead to an excessive idealization of the abuser.
Exactly, making identification with them and justification of the abuse more likely.
And what about social circles? If they see marrying someone of high status as a major achievement.
That can exert immense pressure on women to stay, absolutely. They might downplay any reports of abuse with arguments like, but where will you go? You'll lose all these opportunities.
It's tough pressure.
It is. And this can lead to a troubling situation where the abused partner actively cooperates with their abuser simply to maintain their social standing, subconsciously transforming that initially protecting, elevating partner into a kind of benevolent authority in their own mind.
Wow. It's a really complex interplay of social pressures, economic dependencies, and the tragic potential for abuse to cultivate those deeply ingrained Stockholm-like attachments.
It really is.
Okay, finally, the review delves into the particularly intense dynamics of narcissist borderline relationships. How the extreme power imbalances and dependency within them can create a pathological cycle that closely mirrors Stockholm Syndrome. This sounds like a particularly destructive combination.
It is indeed. These relationships are often characterized by really extreme power differentials and profound dependency. They frequently lead to what our source very aptly terms a relationship trap.
Okay, a relationship trap.
Yeah, narcissistic individuals, with their inflated sense of self-importance, their constant need for admiration, and their manipulative tendencies. They often form intense, albeit highly dysfunctional, bonds with individuals who exhibit borderline personality traits.
And borderline traits often include that deep fear of abandonment, intense emotions, maybe black and white thinking.
Exactly. That's the typical pattern. So the narcissist, who is constantly seeking validation, kind of preys on the borderline partner's deep-seated fear of being alone. It's incredibly exploitative.
Yeah, it sounds...
The narcissistic partner might use phrases like, "Nobody will ever understand you the way I do," which directly targets the borderline partner's attachment anxieties and their fear of isolation.
Oof.
The borderline individual, in turn, may idealize those fleeting moments of attention or affection from the often emotionally abusive narcissist, viewing them as a desperately needed safe harbor in their own turbulent emotional landscape.
But the reality is often abuse.
Right. The persistent emotional abuse inflicted by the narcissist fosters a profound sense of helplessness in the borderline partner, who then clings even more desperately to those rare positive aspects of the relationship as just a means of survival.
It's that classic abuser tactic again, isn't it? Intermittent reinforcement, just enough positive interaction to keep the victim emotionally hooked.
Precisely. And the narcissist might even actively reinforce this distorted gratitude by occasionally playing the role of the savior.
While the borderline partner's intense fear of abandonment keeps them trapped.
Exactly. And the narcissist's manipulative tactics systematically erode their self-confidence and any belief that they could actually leave the relationship. It creates this devastating emotional dependency where their entire sense of self-worth becomes contingent on the narcissist's approval.
That's just awful.
And the pattern often escalates. Narcissistic individuals may deliberately isolate their borderline partners from their existing support systems, cutting off family, friends, further intensifying their dependency.
Making the narcissist their whole world.
Tragically, yes. And the borderline partner might even actively participate in this isolation, perhaps genuinely believing that only their narcissistic partner truly understands them.
And breaking free must be incredibly hard, especially since, as the review notes, both personality structures can be quite resistant to therapy.
It makes it extremely challenging, yes. So you have this convergence of specific personality traits creating this incredibly intense emotional vortex. The stark power imbalance, the ongoing abuse, the systematic manipulation, it all contributes to the borderline partner developing a deep identification with the narcissistic partner.
It's a tragic form of voluntary captivity, as the review so poignantly describes it.
It really is.
And breaking free necessitates a profound reevaluation of personal trauma, deeply ingrained societal norms, and their entire network of relationships. It truly sounds like a particularly pathological manifestation of the core dynamics we see in Stockholm Syndrome.
Absolutely. The emotional abuse generates that profound sense of helplessness. The sporadic acts of kindness create that distorted emotional bond, and the pervasive fear of abandonment keeps the victim psychologically tethered to their abuser, perpetuating a deeply unhealthy, destructive cycle.
Well, this has truly been a deep dive, hasn't it, into the really multifaceted phenomenon of Stockholm Syndrome.
It certainly has.
We've explored its origins, its core psychological underpinnings, and its surprising connections to broader social and political dynamics, the influence of gender roles, hypergamy, and these destructive patterns that can emerge in certain personality disorders. It's clear that this is far, far more complex than just hostages developing affection for their captors.
Indeed. It's a really complex interplay of survival instincts, power dynamics, the search for meaning, and these deeply ingrained societal forces. It's tangled.
Yeah, very tangled. So as we consider how deeply these dynamics of power, of fear, and that fundamental human search for security are woven into our individual lives, our social interactions, and even our political landscapes, it really prompts a profound question, doesn't it?
What's that?
How can we become more attuned, more aware of these subtle influences in our own lives and in the world around us? And maybe even more fundamentally, what does it truly mean to break free from these cycles of unhealthy attachment and control?
That's the big question.
This deep dive, what we covered a lot, has really only scratched the surface. There are countless avenues for further exploration into the intricate complexities of human behavior under duress, and the fascinating and sometimes, disturbing ways in which we adapt and paradoxically form bonds with those who inflict harm upon us.
Absolutely. So much more to understand.